I guess, I mean, as a starting point, maybe if you just introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your expertise in this particular area.
My name is Bernard Soubry. I'm a writer consultant with the International Institute of Sustainable Development's Earth Negotiations Bulletin. I'm part of a team that, for basically since it started, has gone to UNFCCC COPs and different climate, but also other environmental negotiations around the world, and has kept a record of everything that's gone on, and also a bit of an analysis of what we think is going to happen in the future.
And I mean, in a nutshell, can you describe what the scene at a COP is like? I've never been to one, but I've read a lot about them through things like you mentioned. But what is it like to actually be there?
It's a lot of different zones. I'm going to think specifically back to the Chile Madrid COP, which happened in Madrid, which I was at last time. And you walk in through security, and it's usually this big floor with all sorts of country exhibits. Every country will have a pavilion, and they'll be sort of showing off different projects that they've been involved in, or sometimes they'll have wine, which is quite an enjoyable experience. But this is where like a lot of people tend to hang out. So it's these huge crowds of people. And as you sort of progress into the COP, access gets a little bit more restricted because everybody who's registered for the COP is sort of allowed onto the main floor, but then there are negotiation rooms that go in, and they're the rooms, depending on where you are, tend to get a little bit more windowless and a little bit more boring. But this is where sort of initial negotiations on very specific items will take place. And then you'll also have, in sort of spatially in parallel, you'll also have these really big halls. So, the COP and also the different bigger structures inside the UNFCCC, sometimes they have to meet all together, which means that there needs to be a lot of space. Sometimes they're dealing with really specific issues, and so they'll break out into working groups and subgroups. And this is what we see for the Paris Agreement, where you're still negotiating parts of articles. So you go into this room with like 30 other people, and they'll have a representative from all of the different parties. So it starts off oftentimes when you show up at the COP, and it's just totally overwhelming in terms of people. And then the deeper and deeper you get into the bureaucracy, the more it's like groups of 20 people all huddling around a single piece of text to try to figure something out. And then you send it back out into the huge crowd.
Right. And tell me a little bit about the ground rules of a COP, like what guides what is done there and how it's done.
There's so much, it's very difficult to explain. But the idea is that, so I think it's important to differentiate maybe between what we call a COP and what the event is that is actually going on. The UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has a bunch of different things happening inside it at all times. Sometimes it's like, they're called SBs, subsidiary bodies. One of them is on scientific and technical advice. One of them is on implementation. These are separate from the Conference of the Parties, which is supposed to be this annual meeting of all of the different countries that are party to the UNFCCC. And so you've got subsidiary bodies, you've got the COP, which is everybody. You've also got the Paris Agreement. And so you can have countries who are not in the Paris Agreement in the same building as everybody else while all of these negotiations are going on. And so the ground rules are often that you'll try to negotiate according to all of these different processes. The Kyoto Protocol still going on, the UNFCCC as sort of a bigger structure overseeing everything, the Paris Agreement as a thing that's still being negotiated and is, in different stages of implementation wherever you are. Maybe the most important thing to understand is that everything that's going on, all of these different processes, they're all happening by consensus. There are, when we speak about ground rules, no official rules for how things work at a COP. It's based on the way that things have been done before. there are draft rules of procedure, but you can't apply them. So nowhere, for example, does it say that if a proposal comes up and there's a 2/3 majority, then it's adopted and there's nothing anybody can do about it. You can always have somebody come in and block a proposal or something that's been put on the floor up until the last minute, up until it's adopted, which is oftentimes what you see in COPs, where you're trying to negotiate something to the last minute. And that's why it goes for so long, because everybody has to be on the same page. Sometimes that's good because it means that, certainly in terms of climate action, countries who want to be a little bit more recalcitrant, or like who are pushing against more ambitious climate action, still have to be in the room. So they're kind of dragged along whether they want to be or not. But sometimes it's bad because they are trying to push against climate action in some ways. So you end up having to sort of lower ambition to meet something that they can accept.
And in terms of the Paris Agreement, what are some of the key things that, for example, in Glasgow, the parties will be coming back to and digging into and talking about?
The major thing is what we call Article 6. So this is a specific article of the Paris Agreement which deals with carbon markets internationally. It's been a really long haul to try to negotiate it. Essentially, the way in which or whether countries who have reduced their emissions should be able to sell off those emissions reductions to different countries hasn't yet been agreed on. There's a lot of really specific technical stuff, but it has to do sort of very broadly with whether or not certain things should be counted within a reduction. If you've reduced a certain amount of carbon, can you sell it off, and can another country then call that its own reduction in carbon emissions? I'm not going to go too far into specifics, but that's really the main thing that we need for international cooperation to be worked out. There's a couple of other smaller things, but I think all eyes are really going to be on that. In the past couple of meetings, that's really been the biggest anchor dragging us back.
Okay. And can you also talk a little bit about nationally determined contributions?
Yeah, so 2020 is an interesting year for this. When the main philosophy of the Paris Agreement is really interesting, because previous climate agreements, including, for example, Kyoto, have all been based around this idea of sort of top-down regulation, where the UNFCCC agrees, we're going to do this and everybody better implement this. It has not been very effective in the past. And so the Paris Agreement changed its strategy by saying what we're going to ask for is, at first, before the Paris Agreement was ratified by countries and implemented and came into force, we're going to ask for intended contributions. We're going to ask countries to say, what are you going to do here? And then that becomes what's called a nationally determined contribution. So every country gets to say, based on our circumstances, based where we're at in terms of development or our energy sources or the amount of technology we have available to us, this is how much we can reduce emissions. This is how much we can transition to a renewable circular economy. And because just saying this kind of thing isn't actually helpful towards progress, the Paris Agreement has a ratcheting up mechanism built into it. The idea is that you submit an NDC, and every 5 years you submit a new one, and it has to be more ambitious than the last. So 2020 is a year for submitting NDCs, and then 2025, 2030. And then I think it's by 2023 is when it starts, there's a global stock take. So 2 years before your new NDC is due, everybody comes together and says, okay, we all tried to do this. Here's where we're actually at. And then that helps everybody sort of see what the great successes have been, what some of the failures have been, and everyone sort of pushes each other towards a higher level of ambition. It's meant to be a mechanism to really point out the countries that are being leaders and some of them that are being laggards, and help everybody be a little bit more ambitious.
Great. And I feel like the last question I have for you is more kind of thinking about the people participating in the mock COP. Like, I guess it's any like advice, they have an opportunity to do this process in some ways to influence what might happen in Glasgow, in other ways to reimagine how this works and what the possibilities are. And so I don't know if you have any kind of parting words in terms of what they should think about in terms of how this has been working so far.
I think one of the big criticisms that comes out of the Paris Agreement, um, people call it dangerously incrementalist. So there's a risk that when you ask people to give you something that's just a little bit better than what you had, everybody's just going to move extremely slowly. And what is desired, what remains to be desired out of the processes that I've seen so far is that people are really good at calling for more ambition in the Paris Agreement process, but they're not really good at showing us what it's like. I haven't seen big examples of countries coming together and genuinely devoting lots of money to different things or to building agreements that are not just saying like we're going to try to be more ambitious, but that are actually committing to radically transformative changes in the way that they manage their energy or the way that they manage their relationships with other countries. I guess it's not so much advice as it is a request from the bottom of my heart for all of the participants here, but show Glasgow what ambition actually looks like. It is a mock COP, but you're dealing with real issues. So make the deals that need to be made, not for your own self-interest as a country, but for the interest of the world and for the interest of generations to come. That's what we want to show people rather than the same selection of empty promises we've always had.
I mean, that's a good message.
End on a button.